Okay, you're thinking.
I'll call the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure to order. Pursuant to Committee Rule 6F and House Rule 11, Clause 2 HF, the chairman may postpone further proceedings today on any question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment in which a recorded vote of the yeas and nays are ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's meeting without objection. That is so ordered. A bill and amendment text have been distributed electronically, and paper copies are available here in the hearing room. Finally, I'd ask unanimous consent for the committee to use amendments roster for any items under consideration by the committee. And without objection, that's so ordered. Today, the committee is considering 7 measures and 15 GSA resolutions. Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1547, the One Seat, One Ride Act. Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4693, the Tennessee Valley Authority Salary Transparency Act. H.R. 4762 to amend Title 49 United States Code to extend the non-premium war risk insurance program. House Resolution 609 expressing opposition to Central Business District tolling program of New York City. Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1752, the Eliminating Barriers to Rural Internet Development Grant Eligibility Act, and H.R. 532, the designate the federal building and United States Courthouse located at 600 East 1st Street in Rome, Georgia, as a Harold L. Murphy Federal Building and United States Courthouse Act. H.R. 4688 to direct the administrator of the General Service to sell the property known as the Webster School Act, and 15 General Service Administration Capital Investment and Leasing Program resolutions. So our first item for consideration is H.R. 1547, the One Seat Ride Act, and I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials and the Subcommittee on Highways and Transit from further consideration of H.R. 1547. Without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. And Mr. Kane is recognized to offer his amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
Clerk, please designate the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1547 offered by Mr. Kane of New Jersey.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for the purposes of further amendment. And I now recognize Mr. Kane for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record letters of support from various mayors and officials along the Raritan Valley line for H.R. 1547.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. I am proud to introduce my amendment in the nature of a substitute to my bill, H.R. 1547, the One Seat Ride Act. Anyone living in this part of New Jersey or along the Raritan Valley line can describe to you the difficulties of commuting to and from New York City. Many New Jerseyans and 7th District residents have voiced their frustration about this commute many times over the years. 7th Congressional District residents who travel to and from Manhattan by train are regularly frustrated with unnecessary delays, mainly due to the aged infrastructure, often making weekly commute hours more than they need to be. Worsening matters, passengers traveling on the New Jersey Transit Raritan Valley line must change trains almost always on a different track at Newark Penn Station to make trips to the city. During peak commute hours, Raritan Valley line passengers have very little time to make their way alongside thousands of other rush passengers through Newark Penn Station. As you can imagine, this experience is stressful and not what a commuter needs to start or end their workday. These daily transfers make trips longer and increasingly exhausting for passengers. Longer commute times cause commuters to spend less time with their families, making it more difficult to make their child's sporting events, scouting meetings, and to be absent from those cherished family dinners. Now, there are one-seat ride trains during off-peak hours on the Raritan Valley line, but these off-peak options do nothing to ease the burden on daily commuters working traditional weekday hours. According to the Raritan Valley Line Coalition, the RVL makes up about 10% of New Jersey Transit's daily ridership system-wide. Additionally, the impact of a one-seat ride service has been studied in a report published by the Regional Planning Association. The report shows its impacts on towns surrounding the train line. Rail lines with one-seat service into Manhattan are far more desirable and encourage more development of residential housing units, retail stores, and offices located near existing rail train stations, Some benefits of a town with one-seat ride option are towns with one-seat ride service have fewer vacancies and are more diverse and economically viable. Selection of restaurants, stores, and offices in the downtown. Increasing train service westbound, allowing towns along the RVL to flourish. My hope in the future is to get as many commuters on rail traveling westbound in the morning as they do eastbound, and to the east in the evening. The ANS to HR 1547 directs the Secretary of Transportation to analyze various obstacles to implementation of single-seat trips on commuter passenger rail, and requires the Secretary to conduct a cost-benefit analysis of a one-seat trip during peak times on New Jersey's Raritan Valley line. Furthermore, the Secretary must submit the report to this committee and the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs within 1 year of this legislation enactment. One-seat ride on the RVL is something that my constituents and many New Jerseyans wanted to see become a reality before the completion of the Gateway project years down the road. As I said during our Amtrak hearing a few months ago, I am a full supporter of the Gateway project, as I know my colleague, the Rail Committee Ranking Member Payne, is. And finally, I want to thank Representative Bonnie Watson-Coleman for being a co-sponsor of this critical legislation. And I want to recognize her for being a leader in this effort, because her district is as impacted by this lack of a one-seat ride as my district is. I've urged passage of my ANS and passage of the underlying bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. I'd yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. And I'd like to thank the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Kane, for his work on this bipartisan piece of legislation. The one-seat ride issue for commuter rail passengers has been something that Representative Kane has championed both here in Congress and in the New Jersey State Senate. The bill directs the Secretary of Transportation to conduct a study analyzing the costs and benefits of providing commuter rail service that does not require riders to change trains, specifically examining the New Jersey Transit Raritan Valley line. With that, I would urge support of the bill, and I now recognize Mr. Larson for his statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This legislation directs the Department of Transportation to conduct a study of the benefits of one-seat commuter rail transit nationwide and the obstacles transit agencies face in providing that level of service. The bill also requires a cost-benefit analysis for one specific transit line, New Jersey Transit's Raritan Valley line. A comprehensive study was completed last year by New Jersey Transit on this topic at Mr. Kane's request during his time in the New Jersey State Senate. The study concluded there are two basic ways to provide a transfer-free ride into New York City for Mr. Kane and other constituents. One is to decrease service on the other New Jersey Transit lines, which would negatively affect other transit riders, or move ahead with the Gateway program, which will provide more capacity for all New Jersey Transit lines that go into New York Penn Station. Local officials in New Jersey and New York are actively pursuing that option and have received substantial funding from the Biden administration, including through the BIL. In the first ever round of mega grants, the administration awarded $292 million to the Hudson Yards site where the new Trans-Hudson Tunnel will land. The Federal Transit Administration has awarded $767 million to build a new Portal Bridge. Democrats on this committee supplemented that with an additional $77 million for the American Rescue Plan. The Biden administration also recently approved the new Hudson River Tunnel into the second phase of the CIG program. In terms of cost-benefit analysis, there's no more rigorous transportation analysis than the CIG program. Projects are vetted often for years on criteria, including their financial plans, mobility benefits, and cost effectiveness. Based on that analysis and the merits of the project, FTA staff is working hard to finalize a full funding grant agreement to deliver $6.9 billion for the new tunnel, which would be the largest CIG grant in history. For those on the committee interested in supporting more New Jersey transit service, and for those of you from other states who have your own transit priorities, the best way to support them is for Congress to provide significant resources through the CIG program. The 82% funding cut proposed recently in the budget would make it all but Republican budget would make it all but impossible to build a tunnel. So while local officials are bringing billions of dollars to the table for a project with national implications, the federal government has to be a partner as well. That's true for major transit projects across the country. CIG spending cuts will jeopardize projects in South Carolina, Texas, Illinois, California, and other states. Cuts to CIG would slow down funding in my state, in my district, for the Linwood Link project, which would expand transit access in my district. Given that, I have a request from my colleagues today. In addition to just voting to study the need for more transit service, I'd encourage you also to support funding for more transit service, and look forward to partnering with Mr. Kane and anyone else who supports this bill on ways to expedite and deliver better transit service for all of our constituents. And with that, I yield back.
Anyone else have an opening statement on the bill? Seeing none, we're now going to move into amendments. And for what purpose does Mr. Payne seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk, please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1547, offered by Mr. Payne, number 047.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. And Mr. Payne, you're recognized for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member. Appreciate the opportunity. My amendment ensures the cost-benefit analysis done on the Raritan Valley line considers the impact single-seat service on this line would have across the New Jersey Transit Rail network. As I mentioned earlier, this is a problem of capacity. And if this cost-benefit analysis just focuses on the Raritan Valley line without accounting for any knock-on effects that the single-seat service could have throughout the network, it wouldn't have been a holistic study. For that simple reason, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Mr. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank my colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, who is the ranking member of the Rail Subcommittee, for offering this amendment. I am in full support of this amendment, and I urge my colleagues to support it as well.
Any other members wish to be recognized on the amendment? Seeing none, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I do support the amendment, which adds a very reasonable element when looking at cost-benefit analysis. And I would urge support of the amendment. Anyone else wish to be heard? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. To the amendment in the nature of a substitute, all those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Now we'll move to, again, Mr. Payne, what reason do you seek recognition? Clerk, please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1547, offered by Mr. Payne, number 048.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Payne, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment would ask the Office of the Secretary to consider the on-time completion of 2 projects in the region that will drastically assist in increasing capacity in New York's Penn Station from New Jersey. The Hudson Tunnel project would create a new 2-track tunnel under the Hudson River, effectively doubling the current capacity of trains that can travel from Secaucus, New Jersey to New York's Penn Station. Like the current North Tunnel under the Hudson River, the Portal Bridge is another choke point, limiting capacity in the region for passengers, such as those along the Raritan Valley line. Today, 450 trains go across this 113-year-old bridge daily, making it the busiest rail bridge in the United States. The new Portal Bridge would replace this outdated bridge with the modern and more reliable one that will be capable of handling longer and higher capacity from New Jersey Transit trains. And mind you, the Portal North Bridge was designed after the Civil War and was built in 1910. While I understand that Mr. Keene wants to focus on the current situation New Jersey residents on the Raritan Valley line find themselves in, I believe it is also important for us as lawmakers to be visionaries and look to the future and see what our rail system could look like upon the completion of this critical infrastructure project. I urge my colleagues to support this common sense amendment, and I yield back.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Mr. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to thank my colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, for offering this amendment. However, I must respectfully oppose this amendment. This amendment is correct that when on-time completion of various projects associated with the Gateway project, such as the Hudson Tunnel project, the Portal Bridge project, and others, would increase the number of single-seat rides in Penn Station. But that's upon completion. My commuters and Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman's commuters need access on one-seat ride before the completion of all of those projects. So from a time sensitivity, as well as making sure this is done on a real-time basis, I mean, I am a full supporter of the Gateway project. I was on the state level, as well as now here in Congress, as well as the various component parts thereof. But this is an issue that cannot afford to wait until the actual completion of the Gateway project, and I urge the opposition to this amendment.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing no one, the question is on the amendment to the nature, or to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. It appears that the nays have it. The nays do have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Yes, Mr. Payne. A recorded vote has been requested as previously announced pursuant to Committee Rule 6F. We'll postpone the question. All right, Mr. Menendez, for what reason do you seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1547 offered by Mr. Menendez, number 015.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Menendez, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with my colleagues, Mr. Kane and Ms. Watson-Coleman, that we should examine opportunities to improve commuter experiences through options that improve comfort and convenience for all riders. My amendment simply expresses a sense of Congress that the findings from this study should not be used to negatively impact the commuter experience for riders or decrease efficiency on commuter passenger rail or public transit. One-seat rides make the rider experience better. They're more convenient, quicker, and don't require walking between platforms or waiting for another train or bus. However, I want to make sure we're taking an approach that maximizes efficiency for our entire rail network. Trans-Hudson capacity is limited and will continue to be limited until the Gateway project is complete. Until then, we need to prioritize solutions that improve transportation across our region. I agree with my colleagues' efforts to study the costs and benefits of one-seat rides. I want commuters to have the best possible experience on public transit. But we must also assess whether our infrastructure can handle more single-seat trips and whether these options increase congestions in other parts of the transit network. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Mr. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank my colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Menendez, for offering this amendment. However, I must respectfully oppose this amendment. The amendment is too broad in its construction, and I believe that the reason of this legislative body and many others is to get the best possible data as to real-time needs, what's going on, and we should not be limiting results of studies and things that they can be used for. My constituents and others around the state need information on a timely basis, and I believe that the addition of a one-seat ride option on the Raritan Valley line is necessary and a benefit that many other New Jersey commuters have along other New Jersey transit lines, and they enjoy it. And it's important that as we're looking at the overall data that comes out of this study and any other data that the federal DOT or the local transportation services provide to ensure that we provide the best possible service for all New Jersey residents and commuters. And so therefore I will oppose this amendment.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing no one, the question is on the amendment. To the amendment in the nature of a substitute, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. It appears that the nays have it. The nays do have it. The amendment is defeated. Does anyone else have an amendment? Seeing none, again, as noted, there are recorded votes to the amendments requested. So again, pursuant to Committee Rule 6F, further proceedings on the measure are postponed. And now we'll move on to the next item for consideration, which is H.R. 4693, the Tennessee Valley Authority Salary Transparency Act. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment from further consideration of H.R. 4693. Without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Mr. Cohen, recognized to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank you and the committee for working with us on this to come with, we believe, is an amendment that will move us forward. And I want to thank Mr. Burchett, who's been very helpful to me on this issue, and been a leader on this issue on TVA, and Mr. Garrett Graves, who's also come again.
Go ahead and
Mr. Garrett Graves has been helpful in voicing his support for this bill when Mr. Lash was before us. What were you saying?
you have an amendment at the desk.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Please designate the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4693 offered by Mr. Cohen.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute is considered as read and shall be considered as base text for the purpose of further amendment. And you have anything else?
I want to thank all the members of the Academy.
Mr. Chairman,
Nothing else.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I'm not sure of the proper motion, but I would like to also speak on that, if that'd be okay.
You have 5 minutes.
I don't want 5 minutes, thank you, though. And, but I do want to thank, I always want to call him Chairman Cohen, because he was chairman of state and local. We were at the state senate years ago, my dear friend. And I always want to call him Senator Cohen, but I realize it's Representative Cohen. I know that brings a lot of, when I say Senator Cohen, it makes some people nervous, so, and it should.
Marcia more so.
Yeah, but of course, the TVA Salary Transparency Act, it returns proper oversight power to Congress. And TVA is always supposed to report their employees' salary to Congress, and it did until recently. And this bill ensures that we get the information we need to hold TVA accountable, such as employment data for board members, executives, and certain senior management. The folks in East Tennessee shouldn't have to worry about the rates going up just so some executives can get a fatter salary. TVA is a government entity, dadgummit, and they should be upfront about how it operates. And I always want to thank my good friend Congressman Cohen, who actually called my mama when my dad died, and I always remember that. So he's been a dear friend to me and my family, and I thank him for including me on this legislation in his kind words, and I yield the remainder of my time.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Mr. Cohen.
Mr. Chair, yes, I would like to add a few comments on this. The TVA was created by Congress in 1933. Franklin Roosevelt, one of the great reforms to help the Valley, which was poor at the time. But their mission has shifted greatly over the decades. And their website says they remain serving the people of the Tennessee Valley region to make life better through our work in energy, the environment, and economic development. And that's indeed what they should do. But with innovations in areas like hydroelectric and nuclear power, TVA has done good for the Valley, but there's room for improvement, especially when it comes to transparency. Congress may not fund TVA directly anymore, but did create them, and they're still part of the federal government. In addition to their constitutionally mandated mission, that comes with extra responsibility to be transparent and accountable to the public. As many of this committee have heard, I've asked TVA for salary transparency time and again, but have been refused information beyond the 5 highest paid employees, which is what's required by their SEC disclosure. Over the years, I've been suspicious of some of their hiring and compensation practices, and that's the kind of problem that could be seen by the public and told to the public and maybe prohibited by having these salaries released and distributed to the public. I believe in TVA's mission to make life better for the people of the Tennessee Valley, but I think they've strayed from their purposes in some ways. They've had coal ash problems, they've had environmental problems, and they're not getting away from fossil fuels as quickly as they should. The TVA Salary and Transparency Act is the first hope, and what I hope will be a better direction for TVA. Want to put them closer in line with their public service mission. We've worked with Mr. Lyash. I think he's got good intentions, and I really personally like him. This bill, which reinstates and updates Congress's access to salary information on TVA's upper-level employees, will allow this committee to better fulfill its duty of government oversight. I would like to quote my Chief of Staff, Marilyn Dillahay, who told me many, many years ago, progress is evolutionary, not revolutionary. So I appreciate this evolutionary change and benefit. Appreciate your vote.
I now recognize Mr. Larson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I support the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by my committee colleague, Mr. Cohen, Representative Cohen. Representative Cohen's been a tireless advocate in promoting additional transparency at the management structure of the TVA, a power generating company that reported roughly $12.5 billion in total operating revenues on 163 billion kilowatt hours of electricity sales for fiscal year 2022. As noted in recent hearings before the Subcommittee on Water Resources and the Environment, the TVA falls within the oversight responsibility of this committee, and included within that responsibility is oversight of how TVA is structured and managed, including information on the salaries and job responsibilities of executives, management, and board. For decades, TVA was required to provide that information to this committee as part of our annual oversight. However, in 1995, the requirement to disclose the management structure and salaries of TVA executives was eliminated as part of a larger purge of antiquated federal agency reporting requirements. But I do applaud Representative Cohen and Representative Birch's efforts to reinstate and modernize this reporting obligation by TVA. This amendment in the nature of a substitute addresses several bipartisan changes to the introduced bill, including ensuring the renewed reporting requirement only applies to TVA's management, executives, and board members who are compensated at or above the GS-15 level. The amendment also responds to concerns that TVA raised that public disclosure of salaries of these individuals could negatively affect workforce retention or recruitment. To address this concern, the amendment ensures Congress is provided with complete information on individuals serving as part of TVA's management, executives, or board members, including job descriptions and salary, while also ensuring the salary information is not automatically disclosed to the public under requirements of the Access to Congressionally Mandated Reports Act from the last Congress. It's a fair compromise between our legitimate oversight responsibilities over TVA and the needs of TVA to retain and maintain a pool of talented, diverse, and effective management staff, executives, and board members. I appreciate the hard work of the Tennessee representatives on the committee for working with the committee and the stakeholders of the Tennessee Valley region to reach this compromise, and appreciate the chairman's willingness to work in a bipartisan manner as well to reach agreement on this bill. I support the ANS, and if approved, I support the underlying legislation. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Rouser, 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. As I think everybody knows, this issue falls under the jurisdiction of the Water Resources Subcommittee, and I'm not going to repeat what has already been said in terms of the facts and good points that have already been made, other than to congratulate Representatives Cohen and Burchett for their good work. Support this amendment and yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Does anyone else wish to be heard? Seeing no other speakers, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to 4693? Any other amendments? Hearing none. The question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4693. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question is now on the adoption of and favorably reported of H.R. 4693 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill as amended is agreed to and ordered reported favorably to the House. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Moving on, our next item for consideration is H.R. 4762 to amend Title 49 United States Code to extend the non-premium war risk insurance program. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Aviation from further consideration of H.R. 4762. Without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration without objection. The first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I'd recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement. First, I want to thank Representative Yakum of Indiana, the Vice Chair of the Aviation Subcommittee, for his leadership on this issue. The bill would extend the authority of the FAA to offer non-premium aviation war risk insurance to contracted air carriers and those participating in the Civil Reserve Air Fleet program through fiscal year 2025. H.R. 4762 is going to ensure that contracted air carriers maintain the ability to meet the federal government and the military's mission objectives and in operations without any disruption. I do appreciate the bipartisan collaboration that went into this bill, and I urge my colleagues to support this common sense legislation. And with that, I recognize Mr. Larson, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Chair, I support this legislation, which extends through 2025 the non-premium insurance program that covers commercial air carriers that undertake missions for the government. This includes aircraft operating under contract with the Department of Defense as part of the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, or CRAF program. Without such insurance, these aircraft could not be used to conduct critical missions for the U.S. government. The role of these aircraft, among other things, is to augment the Air Mobility's Command long-range inter-theater C-5s and C-17s during periods of increased airlift needs, from minor contingencies to full national defense emergencies. I call upon the committee to extend this program, support this bill, and yield back.
Mr. Yakum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bill which I introduced with Representative Sykes would extend the FAA's non-premium war risk insurance program through fiscal year 2025. While this program maybe is not the hottest topic of the day, it's certainly vitally important all the same. Federal agencies contract at times with private air carriers to help move personnel, cargo, relief supplies, and other goods both domestically and internationally. This includes the Defense Department's Civil Air Reserve Fleet, which assists our nation's military in emergencies where its airlift needs exceed available capacity.
She does.
Sometimes these charters are heading into unstable areas. Other times they aren't. Regardless of the destination, the planes don't take off without war risk insurance. And in cases where the private market cannot offer this insurance on reasonable terms, the FAA provides a backstop through its non-premium war risk insurance program. Under this program, the FAA pays any valid claims out of its aviation insurance revolving fund, with the contracting agency reimbursing the FAA. Thankfully, claims are relatively rare. According to FAA data, there have only been $2.5 million in claims paid out since fiscal year 2018. And no claims have been paid out since fiscal year 2022 or this fiscal year, in either year. Mr. Chairman, the FAA's non-premium war risk insurance program is a small but important program that enables private air carriers to answer the call to help our nation's military, disaster relief operations, and other vital missions. I want to thank you today for holding today's markup on this legislation. I want to thank Ms. Sykes for her partnership as well. I urge my colleagues to support, and I yield back.
Ms. Sykes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, I would like to thank my colleague on the other side of the aisle, my fellow Midwesterner from Indiana, Mr. Yakum, for working together on this very critical piece of legislation. As my colleague mentioned, our legislation extends the authorization for the non-premium war risk insurance program at the Federal Aviation Administration. As an Ohioan, we certainly know a thing or two about in the insurance industry, but I want to get away from the jargon for just a second to talk about this program and what this insurance program actually does and why it is so very critical that we pass this amendment in this legislation. This program provides the insurance coverage necessary for civilian airliners that make up the Civil Reserve Air Fleet. In emergency situations, the Civil Reserve Air Fleet augments the Department of Defense's airlift capacity, giving us the ability to move personnel and material around the globe in times of need. In short, this is a national emergency preparedness necessity. Like any insurance policy, you hope you only have to use it in an emergency, or you never have to use it at all. That's why the Civil Reserve Air Fleet has only been activated 3 times in our nation's history. Once, to help support our troops during the first Gulf War, second, during Operation Iraqi Freedom, and most recently, to help evacuate American citizens and our brave Afghan allies who risk everything, their homes, their families, and their safety in service of American diplomacy and our brave men and women in uniform. Mr. Chairman, I'm proud that today we're advancing legislation that help keeps our nation ready to respond to the threats that it faces and ensures our civilian airlines who answer the call of the Civil Reserve Air Fleet. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this legislation. Thank you again to my colleague and the members of this committee. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the bill? Are there any amendments to H.R. 4762? Hearing none, the question is now on the adoption of and favorably reporting of H.R. 4762, the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Moving on, our next item for consideration is House Resolution 609, expressing opposition to the Central Business District tolling program in New York City. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Highways and Transit from further consideration of House Resolution 609, and without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the resolution for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the resolution is dispensed with. The resolution is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement, and I do appreciate the work of my colleague, Mr. D'Esposito, for offering this resolution. I understand his concerns regarding the CBD tolling program and the potentially devastating economic consequences this program could have on small businesses and commuters alike, from not only from his district but also the region in general, especially when these folks are simply trying to get to work and do their jobs. I understand it. As I understand it, this tolling program could subject daily commuters traveling into the CBD to fees of up to $23 a day, and there may be no daily cap on charges for trucks traveling into the CBD, leading to the potential possibility of unlimited daily charges for them. Furthermore, toll revenue generated from the plan will be allocated to the Metropolitan Transportation Authority to cover $15 billion in capital projects. I do appreciate Mr. D'Esposito's work on this issue and encourage my colleagues to support the resolution. Now recognize Mr. Larson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wish we could have a bipartisan statement on this one, but we don't. I oppose this resolution, which would impose the opinion of this committee on a state and local project without doing anything to change or improve outcomes of the project. It's a congressional resolution disapproving a local project. And is that now what we're going to focus on? Whose congressional district will be the focus of the next disapproval resolution? The CBD tolling program is currently moving through the required highway project delivery process in regular order. It's been approved by the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, New York City, New York State, and the Federal Highway Administration. And I understand the challenges to it, and I understand the differences of opinion that exist in the Northeast on this issue. I understand members on both sides of the aisle have strong views about the project's impacts on their constituents. In the project development and approval process, there have been a number of opportunities for public comment at the state and local level, and some of those opportunities are ongoing. There's a Traffic and Mobility Review Board, a group responsible for recommending the rates and discounts and exemptions, just held its first public meeting this month. These meetings are required so that the public, including members of Congress, can share their concerns and shape the pricing program to improve outcomes. It's both premature and unusual for Congress to express disapproval of a project still under the development that's been approved by state and local government. Further, this project is now, I think as of last weekend, currently the subject of a lawsuit. So is that what this committee as well is going to focus on, passing resolutions about projects undergoing active litigation, which could possibly put the thumb on the scale of the litigation? I support strong community engagement, encourage consultation with stakeholders so that all impacted parties can see the benefits and the costs of this program. This resolution doesn't advance that goal, and I'd ask the committee kind of stay out of this fight for now. And I'd ask folks to oppose this resolution. With that, I yield back.
Mr. D'Esposito.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank you for working with me and my staff on advancing this important piece of legislation before us. I know that you deal with many members and unique issues that they face, and the fact that you made this a priority. I truly do appreciate it. My bill, House Resolution 609, the expressing opposition to the Central Business District tolling program of New York City. This piece of legislation addresses the blatant assault on hardworking Americans commuting into New York City each and every day. This program, commonly referred to as congestion pricing, will charge drivers up to $23 in additional fees just to get into Manhattan below 60th Street. Congestion pricing is a slap in the face not only to New Yorkers, but to all those in the tri-state area commuting who are already navigating record high inflation, a post-pandemic economy, increasing property taxes, rising crime, and MTA fare hikes. Let me be crystal clear. Commuters should not be forced to bail out the MTA for countless years of mismanagement and fiscal irresponsibility. This bipartisan resolution carefully lays out the adverse effects that congestion pricing will have on all of the region's communities and local economies, while expressing the sense of Congress that the MTA and New York Governor Kathy Hochul should stop this reckless plan in its tracks. This bill also strongly recommends that Governor Hochul not only conduct but make public an economic impact report regarding the implementation of congestion pricing. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Representatives Gottheimer, Kane Jr., Van Drew, Lawler, Lalota, Molinaro, Garbarino, Langworthy, Brandon Williams, and Chris Smith for their partnership in advocating for our constituents and taking a bipartisan stand against this obvious cash grab on hardworking Americans. It's time for leaders in Albany to go back to the drawing board and stop taxing their way out of problems of their own creation. Again, Chairman, thank you to you and your staff for your hard work and consideration. I yield back my time.
Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I rise in support of HRES 609. And, I don't live in New York, don't live in New York City, so I've been there several times. I can tell you that it's difficult as it is to travel in Manhattan. This will just make it that much more difficult. And I'll tell you this, that if my friend from New York and basically the entire New York delegation are telling me this is a problem, then I have to believe that this is a problem. And further, the use of revenue derived from traffic on the road to offset the losses in the MTA, as Mr. D'Esposito illustrated, that's just egregious. The mismanagement there, it shouldn't come at the expense of these commuters. So I appreciate the colleagues, my colleagues' work on this. To those who say, well, we shouldn't be interfering in local decisions, well, this is an apples and oranges comparison, because what's happening here is you're siphoning money off of the highways or the city streets to offset the mismanagement of an MTA. So those are two separate modes of transportation that they're sort of commingling. I think that does require a little bit of guidance on our part. So I applaud the efforts of Mr. D'Esposito and my friends from New York and New Jersey and the surrounding area, many of whom are required to travel in that area, commute for work to provide for their families. So let's not make it any more difficult on them than it already is. So under the CBD tolling program, small businesses from my colleagues' districts and the region in general are potentially facing a tax just for operating within or delivering goods into that designated CBD. So I support this. I applaud the efforts of my friend from New York and urge a yes vote and yield back.
Mr. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to add my strong New Jersey voice in support of this resolution. I want to thank my colleague from New York for introducing it. I'm a proud co-sponsor of the bill with colleagues from across the Hudson River and across the political aisle. The congestion pricing plan is deeply flawed. It's unfair, and it represents yet another money grab on New Jersey commuters' wallets. In a time when government officials should be doing everything in our power and in their power to make life more affordable for American families, the MTA's congestion tax is a slap in the face to middle-class New Jersey and New York drivers. with a $23 a day tax to go south of 60th Street in Manhattan. This plan is ill-conceived and will have major impacts on many transportation industries, such as the motor coach industry, the trucking and delivery industries, small businesses that rely on surrounding area tourism. This congestion pricing plan is anti-commuter and anti-small business and only serves to bail out the MTA. This resolution draws a line and sends a message that is wrong for any level of government to pile more tolls and more fees on the backs of commuters in the midst of an unprecedented affordability crisis. Again, I want to thank my colleague, Mr. D'Esposito, for introducing this resolution, and I strongly support passage and urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Van Drew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, another New Jersey voice. This is different. It's not just a local decision. You have to understand this is a regional issue. It's going to affect New York, New Jersey, a lot of folks from Pennsylvania. It's going to affect people from Connecticut. This is a whole region of the state that's going to be affected. New York City is a hub. And by the way, at a time where they're losing some population in New York, and at a time where people are really complaining about the cost of everything. Interest rates have gone up, so we're spending more there. Inflation still definitely exists. So instead of government helping, we're just going to tag on another tax. The answer isn't always more taxation, and actually it's going to hurt revenues in the long run because people are getting tired of it. So I'm very much in support of this. And by the way, it doesn't affect me as much because I'm at the southern half of the state, but it's still important to the whole region, and that's why it's important that we speak out on this issue. So I want to thank the chairman for posting it, and Mr. D'Esposito, I want to thank you for your good work on this, and I'm right with you, shoulder to shoulder. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Molinaro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for moving forward with this piece of legislation. I want to thank my colleague, Mr. D'Esposito from New York, and those from around the region who are joining in sponsoring the resolution. I've spent the last 30 years in public office in the Mid-Hudson Valley and beyond in the state of New York. And we have seen over the course of decades, I know it's hard to believe, Mr. Chairman, but New York continued to add taxation and regulation on its population, forcing so many out of the state, the MTA being among the worst offenders. Currently, the MTA receives half of its revenue from tickets, and the other half of that revenue comes from 7 different established taxes by the state legislature or MTA. They include taxes on small businesses that use or sell gasoline and oil, a tax on mortgage transactions, a tax on cabs and rideshare apps, a tax on employees through a payroll tax, a tax on car and vehicle registration. And in certain parts of the state, they also include dollars and revenues received directly from county governments to subsidize the MTA, despite having no direct connection with the City of New York or MTA services. That subsidy gets passed on in state and local taxation, property taxation, or sales tax to subsidize those costs. And now here we have the MTA yet again with Governor Hochul of New York wanting to create yet one more tax on New Yorkers as if 7 weren't enough. We used to say that we are tired of being the ATM for the MTA. And this bipartisan resolution that I'm proud to co-sponsor wisely disapproves of the MTA's plan and pushes back on New York's effort to yet again overburden and overtax its citizens. And so I urge support for the resolution. I thank my colleague, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted just to weigh in on this and thank Mr. D'Esposito for raising this issue. New Yorkers will be impacted greatly, but New Jerseyans will suffer the consequences. Many bedroom communities in New Jersey work in New York and would have to pay this every single day. Can you imagine your commute to work, $23 every day, times 5 days a week, times 52 weeks a year? It's unconscionable. And so I support Mr. D'Esposito's efforts in this matter, and I yield back.
Mr. Auchincloss.
Thank you, Chairman. Congestion pricing is one of the best tools we have to reduce traffic in densely populated city centers, improve air quality, and rationalize our transportation system around multiple modalities, instead of allowing automobiles to define the scale and granularity of our downtowns. I encourage my colleagues to oppose this resolution. New York plans to institute a toll on vehicles traveling below 60th Street in Manhattan during peak hours, thereby incentivizing increased use of public transit to commute into the city. New York also plans to invest the revenue from the program into improving its train and bus service. Instead of expressing our opposition to this effort, Congress should be pointing to this program as a model for cities struggling with congestion across the country. Congestion pricing allows cities to accurately reflect the cost of having cars in dense areas. Strong Towns has pointed out that this is not just a reflection of the negative externalities of air pollution, traffic, and emissions, but it also allows cities to price in the space that vehicles take up. Manhattan has limited space for car traffic, and it should be allowed to reflect that scarcity through tolls. Cities across the country have been struggling with car-centric planning and transportation models for decades. Approximately a third of the land area in the Phoenix metropolitan region is paved, including about 10% for parking alone. And there is evidence to suggest that in Los Angeles, there is more square footage per person devoted to parking than to housing. Congestion pricing is an opportunity to accurately reflect the cost of vehicle transportation in cities, and I applaud New York for taking this critical step. We should be encouraging cities to adopt innovative policies like congestion pricing, policies that we know work from cities like London and Stockholm. Congress should not be discouraging cities from implementing solutions to manage their own congestion. I urge my colleagues to oppose this resolution, and I yield back.
Mr. Diaz. Mr. What? Mr. Webster.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, I yield my time to Mr. Diaz-Bazillo.
Thank you, sir. I just want to respond to Mr. Auchincloss. So I understand your argument about congestion pricing, and perhaps it works in places like you've mentioned. But if you haven't realized and if you haven't read the news lately, one of the reasons as to why this is the height of hypocrisy is because everyday New Yorkers and New Jerseyans are actually scared to take mass transit because of the crime that has taken over our streets because of policies put in place by the state legislature. I've been on train platforms. I patrolled the streets of New York City for 16 years. When people now come up the Long Island Railroad platform, not only do they have their briefcase and their things that they need for the day, they have something else, a motorized scooter. And when you ask them why they have that scooter, it's because they're afraid to take mass transit in New York City. So perhaps congestion pricing works in certain places, but in New York City and the history that we've had with the MTA, like Mr. Molinaro said, we've served as the ATM for the MTA for far too long. I yield back my time. Thank you.
Anyone else wish to be heard? See no one. Amendments. For what purpose does Mr. Menendez seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk, please designate the amendment.
Amendment to House Resolution 609, offered by Mr. Menendez, number 014.
Without objection, the amendment be considered as read. Mr. Menendez, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate Congressman Diaz-Bazillo's work to highlight the negative impacts of the Central Business District tolling program and agree that the plan as written fails to meet the moment. As this resolution notes, the plan would be detrimental to many of the communities outside the Central Business District, including New Jersey's 8th Congressional District. My amendment highlights the harm this plan will inflict on my constituents and other New Jersey residents without any direct, tangible benefit. If you look at a heat map of the congestion zone, it is impossible to conclude that the MTA's plan will do anything other than push congestion to New York and other areas of New York, especially if commuters alter their travel patterns, for instance, by driving to train stations and bus stops across the 8th District and other boroughs, increasing our local congestion and straining our infrastructure. New Jersey residents will pay the brunt of fees related to this plan and will bear the burden of the environmental challenges that result from this plan, yet our residents won't reap any of the benefits that will be paid for out of their wallets. In fact, this plan stands to shift money away from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, a bi-state agency that provides alternative methods of commuting into Manhattan. Further, there's been no conversation about potentially using funds generated by the plan to extend the 7 line into New Jersey, which would actually provide a real, tangible solution to getting cars off the road. And while New York plans to fund environmental impact mitigation in the Bronx, there is no plan for mitigating the environmental impacts on New Jersey, and that I find to be totally unacceptable. We can all agree that we need to work towards solutions that reduce congestion, but the Central Business District Tolling Program does not generally do so. It is simply a cash grab by the MTA. Again, I thank Mr. D'Esposito for his work to highlight this issue, and I intend to do everything possible to make sure New Jersey's concerns are taken into account. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. D'Esposito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say thank you to my friend, Mr. Menendez. I hope that we can continue to work together to combat what we're facing in the New York, New Jersey, tri-state area. And I thank him for offering the amendment, but I believe that the language that we've laid out, we were methodic and we made sure that it covers all of those affected by congestion pricing without elevating one group over the other. I just oppose the amendments and to take away from the underlying message of the bill, but I do intend to work with Mr. Menendez moving forward to continue our work in battle of congestion pricing.
Are there any other speakers on the amendment? Seeing none, are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. It appears the nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the resolution? Hearing none, the question is now on the adoption of and favorably reported House Resolution 609 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The resolution is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Moving on. Our next item of consideration is H.R. 1752, the Eliminating Barriers to Rural Internet Development Grant Eligibility Act, or eBridge Act. And I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management from further consideration of H.R. 1752. Without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration, and without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered read and open for amendment at any point. And I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk. Clerk, please designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1752, offered by Chairman Graves of Missouri.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for the purpose of further amendment. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement, and I am proud to again support H.R. 1752, the Eliminating Barriers to Rural Internet Development Grant Eligibility Act, or eBridge. Unfortunately, too many of our communities, particularly in rural America, still lack broadband access. And in some cases, just completing that last mile is what stands in the way of connecting people to a job or to the services that they may need. Broadband is critical to conducting and attracting and retaining businesses and telehealth and emergency preparedness and response. Economic Development Administration, the EDA grants can be used to attract jobs and employers to these economically distressed areas. But right now, there are hurdles to using these grants for broadband projects, including difficult last mile efforts that often delay rural broadband deployment. This bill simply removes or takes away those hurdles. Our committee approved this bill in the previous 2 Congresses, and it passed the House last Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support. And with that, I'd urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I recognize Mr. Larson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the eBridge Act, which would create a high-speed broadband initiative at the EDA and make public-private partnerships and consortiums eligible for grant awards. Access to reliable high-speed internet is a vital tool for participation in today's workforce and economy, whether it's learning from home or working from home, communicating virtually with friends and family, or accessing telehealth services. Almost every aspect of our daily lives relies on connection to the internet. Unfortunately, millions of people across the country still don't have access to high-speed internet. For the example, the U.S. Census Bureau estimates approximately 1 in 10 people in my state do not have internet connection into their homes, with 500,000 households relying solely on limited cell phone data plans and 30,000 households still using slower dial-up services. So this federal investment to break down barriers and to break the digital divide is critical in places like Point Roberts, where Woodby Telecom is benefiting from an investment. I'm visiting Hat Island this weekend, a small island in the middle of Puget Sound, which is has received a $2.9 million loan from the USDA. We all wish it was $2.9 billion to deliver high-speed, affordable internet to the island. To people and businesses at Point Roberts, Hat Island, and other communities, this is critical, and I appreciate the Chair's support of eBridge Act and ask my colleagues to support it as well. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Van Drew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also am in strong support of this legislation. You know, in today's world, American society is inseparably bound by many important threads, not the least of which is the internet. Over the past 3 years, internet connection empowered some of the most meaningful moments of our lives. Parents and children could keep up with work and school. Patients utilized telemedicine to receive care from their doctors, and older Americans were able to stay connected with the ones they love. This piece of legislation introduced by Chairman Graves will remove hurdles for broadband projects under Economic Development Administration grants, ensuring that local communities can partner with the private sector, allowing for more flexibility in complying with their funding match requirements. This is going to go a long way in ensuring that rural and economically distressed communities are equipped to use Economic Development Administration grants to develop high-speed broadband access. Access to high-speed broadband connections greatly improve public services such as education, farming, healthcare, and emergency response. Many areas of my district have dealt with these issues where it was hard to have a reliable means of communication during a medical emergency. You probably would never believe that somewhere like New Jersey, but there are rural areas in New Jersey and areas where, unfortunately, there are problems far too often, and we've been fighting this for years, trying to get the broadband that we need. It is essential to give rural and underserved areas across the country the same access to broadband as our cities. For all these reasons, the improvements in this bill will improve the quality of life for our rural and underserved areas, and I urge all my colleagues to support this very critical piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for reintroducing the bill and moving it along. It's extremely important, as my colleagues have already discussed in their time. A couple of things here that there's a pretty good sized pile of money in the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. I assume that this legislation is coordinated with those programs. Also, co-ops are a tradition, not in broadband, but in electrification of rural areas. Many co-ops throughout the nation, some of them in California, some of them in my previous district, would like to have access. So to the extent that the bill includes co-ops, that's a good thing. If not, we may want to seek a modification along the way. Also, in the rural areas in my previous district, the rural communities were unable to really develop the skill set necessary to apply for the grants. And so therein was a problem that they simply couldn't on their own. And so we may look to put some upfront money from this program for the purposes of developing a grant whether it's a public-private partnership or a co-op or whatever, so that they can access the money. So I'd like you to think about that as you go forward. And finally, there are the hungry bears out there known as the national telecoms. They've managed to rip off most of the money that we put up over the last decades or so for this purpose. On some of my meaner days, I'd say anybody but them ought to be written into legislation. So we'll let it go at that. Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much for pushing the bill. I yield back.
Ms. Peltola.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate you reintroducing this bill as well. In Alaska, most of our communities do not have broadband. We have a lot of satellite services, but our service is very slow. And you know, even to book a plane ticket now, you're really expected to have internet service. To find fishing and hunting regulations for when subsistence or sport hunts are available, you need to often refer to the website. And I just want to politely ask government agencies to, when you're creating your websites, please have an option for slow internet or not broadband, because often when we're loading these things onto our computer and our service is very slow, sometimes they don't load at all because it just takes so long. And if you have a lot of graphics or colors or high resolution, it makes it really challenging to access a lot of the websites. So I'm very much looking forward to all of our communities having access to the internet, because just everyday life as an American really assumes that you have that access. So thank you.
Anyone else wish to be heard? Ms. Sykes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Chair, for reintroducing this bill and allowing me to have a few moments to speak about it. I represented a district in Northeast Ohio, and most people don't think, when they think Northeast Ohio, they don't think rural, and they certainly don't think a bridge, a lack of internet access. But we certainly have our challenges, especially in the more rural parts of my districts in Stark County and Portage County. And this type of legislation will be incredibly helpful in ensuring that they have connectivity, not only just throughout the state, but throughout the country. One thing that we found during the pandemic, when people were almost 100% reliant upon broadband, our rural communities in Ohio did not have the ability to compete and participate in the world. And it was a major point of contention for our economic development as we were looking to bring more people back to the state of Ohio, as well as allowing them to move back to their hometowns like I did, although in a more urban area. Not having access to the internet really was one of the major hurdles that kept people from coming back to the great state of Ohio, starting their businesses, building their families and their lives and their futures in the greatest state in this country, if I may say that, Mr. Chair. But one thing I know it is true, that is any way that members of Congress can help alleviate any negative economic hurdles, we are going to do that. And I would call this bill not just a bill for connectivity, but a bill to encourage our economy, to ensure that our economy works for everyone, especially those of us in rural areas and who represent rural areas, and across the nation where we may be not thought about. So, Mr. Chair, thank you again for reintroducing this bill. Thank you to, I'll give an advanced gratitude for my colleagues for passing this so that everyone in our communities have access to one another and, most importantly, living their American dream wherever it is they choose to live it. Thank you. I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard? Seeing none, no one. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1752? Hearing none, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1752. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The nays, the ayes, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now on...
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Yeah, I think you want to do it on the next one. Yeah. The question is now on the...
Hold on, he has to withdraw. Withdraw.
The question is now on the adoption of and favorably reported of H.R. 1752 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The gentleman requested a recorded vote. He did, he already did. As previously announced pursuant to Committee 6F, further proceedings on the question are postponed. And we have 4 markups that are going on right now, so we're going to be voting here before too much longer, so I would start gathering members to be here when we do vote. So moving on, the next item of consideration is H.R. 532, the bill to designate the federal building in the United States Courthouse located at 600 East First Street in Rome, Georgia, as a Harold L. Murphy Federal Building in the United States Courthouse. And I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management from further consideration of H.R. 532, and without objection, that is so ordered. And I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. This bill honors Judge Harold L. Murphy, who is a former judge of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia, by naming the federal building and the United States Courthouse in Rome, Georgia, after him. Nominated to the United States District Court by President Jimmy Carter, Judge Murphy served on the federal bench for 45 years. It is fitting, I believe, that we honor the late Judge Murphy by naming his courthouse after him. And I now recognize Mr. Larson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support H.R. 532, which designates the federal building and courthouse in Rome, Georgia as the Harold L. Murphy Federal Building and U.S. Courthouse. Judge Harold Murphy was born in Felton, Georgia, son of a farmer and a school teacher. Served in the U.S. Navy during World War II, and after the war attended the University of Mississippi and University of Georgia School of Law. The youngest member elected to the Georgia House of Representatives, he served for 5 terms before being appointed to serve as a Superior Court judge in the Tallapoosa Circuit by then Governor Jimmy Carter. After Governor Carter was elected president, he nominated Judge Murphy to serve as a Northern District judge. Judge Murphy remained on the bench until 2017 when he took senior status. He remained an active senior judge until his death on December 28, 2022, at the age of 95. I ask the committee to support this legislation. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Proud to support H.R. 532, which was introduced by our colleague from Georgia, Ms. Taylor Greene. This bill, as already stated, would name the United States Courthouse in Rome, Georgia, after Harold L. Murphy, a judge known for his fair and impartial service on the District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. Judge Murphy's commitments to public service is exemplified by his service on the bench over many years and in the United States Navy during World War II. I urge my colleagues to support the bill and I yield the balance.
Does anyone else wish to be heard? Seeing no further speakers, are there any amendments to H.R. 532? Hearing none, the question is now on the adoption of and favorably reported of H.R. 532 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 4688 to direct the Administrator of General Services to sell the property known as the Webster School. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management from further consideration of H.R. 4688, and without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank Delegate Holmes Norton and Subcommittee Chairman Perry for their leadership on this bill. The bill directs the sale of the Webster School, which is located in downtown Washington, D.C. The building has been empty since GSA acquired the building in 2003. And federal real estate portfolio has far too much empty space in it, and we should not hold on to known empty buildings at taxpayers' expense. With that, I would recognize Mr. Larson for 5 minutes for his statement on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support H.R. 4688, which directs the GSA to sell the federal property known as the Daniel Webster School in Washington, D.C. for fair market value by December 31st, 2025. In 2003, the Secret Service asked GSA to purchase the Webster building to provide a better security buffer for the Secret Service headquarters building adjacent to the Webster School. Unfortunately, the Secret Service never assumed responsibility for the building. They've never paid rent to the GSA, and they've never maintained the building, and they never used the building, leaving GSA to carry the expenses for an unoccupied building for 20 years. GSA's owned portfolio should include buildings that are in good condition, that don't have large capital liabilities, that can command a rent that can make a profit, and that GSA can fill with satisfied federal tenants. It should not have to carry the expenses for an unoccupied building for decades. Since the Secret Service has made little effort to obtain the funding to renovate and occupy the building, and GSA's previous efforts to repurpose the building were unsuccessful, it makes sense for the GSA to sell the building. So I commend my T&I colleagues, Congresswoman Holmes Norton and Representative Perry, for introducing this legislation. I support it. I encourage my colleagues to do the same, and I yield back.
Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. I'm proud to co-sponsor H.R. 4688 and want to thank Ms. Holmes Norton for her leadership on the issue and long advocacy. This is a simple and straightforward bill. It directs the General Services Administration to sell the vacant Webster School building in downtown Washington, D.C., which I actually don't think has any nexus to my colleague Daniel Webster. So if you're thinking we're selling his assets, I don't think we are. But Ms. Norton asked GSA about the status of the Webster School at the subcommittee roundtable in March of this year, and the GSA indicated that they were working with the agency interested in the building, the Secret Service, on their long-term plans. The building was originally purchased, as said, by GSA at the request of the Secret Service in 2003. However, for 20 years, 20 long years, no plans or funding have been secured for its federal use, and the building has sat vacant in disrepair in the middle of downtown Washington, D.C. Makes absolutely zero sense. This building has been empty since GSA acquired the building long ago. We had a subcommittee hearing earlier this month, where GA reported the actual utilization of agency headquartered building as low as 9%. That's a building that's being used. Of course, this one isn't. Most of the buildings GAO analyzed had utilization rates of less than 25%. While we're working to figure out how to get departments and agencies to consolidate and either fill or get rid of vacant space, we should at least be able to pass this bill to address this glaring example of waste right here in our nation's capital. This bill requires GSA to dispose of the Webster School for fair market value by December 31st, 2025, so they got plenty of time. And this is just a small step in right-sizing the real estate portfolio. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield the ballots.
Ms. Norton.
I want to thank Chair Graves for marking up this bill, and I thank Subcommittee Chair Perry for co-leading this common sense bill. This bill will direct the General Services Administration to sell the federal property known as the Daniel Webster School, which is located in the District of Columbia, for fair market value by December 31st, 2025. Built in 1882, the Daniel Webster School, a red brick three-story building, has been used for a variety of purposes over the years. However, since the 1980s, the building, which is located in downtown, has been vacant and has fallen into disrepair. GSA purchased the Webster School 20 years ago upon the request of the Secret Service, and yet neither the Secret Service nor the General Services Administration has ever used the building. This bill would return the site to productive use. During my service in the Congress, I have enacted bipartisan bills to transfer unused or underused federal land in D.C. to D.C. or the private sector to redevelop neighborhoods and to generate tax revenue. This includes the southeast and southwest waterfronts. My hope is to see the Daniel Webster School similarly reactivated. The sale provision in this bill is the same as the sale provision in the bill enacted in 2016 that directed the General Services Administration to sell the federal property in D.C. known as the Cotton Annex, which is now being converted into housing. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the bill? Seeing no further speakers, are there any amendments to H.R. 4688? Hearing none, the question is now on the adoption of and favorably reporting of H.R. 4688 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Yeah. Our next items for consideration are 15 General Service Administration, or GSA, capital investment and leasing program resolutions. I'd ask unanimous consent to call up the resolutions en bloc and that they be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, that is so ordered. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement on the GSA resolutions. Today, we are considering these 15 resolutions, all of which are leases for community-based outpatient clinics of the United States Department of Veterans Affairs. These CBOCs will expand veterans' access to health care and fill service delivery gaps which occur across the country. And I'm happy to note that one of these outpatient clinics will be in my home state of Missouri. And I look forward to the positive impact it's going to have on veterans in my state. I'd urge my colleagues to approve these resolutions en bloc, and I now recognize Mr. Larson for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the 15 leasing resolutions before us today. They each authorize appropriations for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs to lease space for community-based outpatient clinics, or CBOCs, in Florida, Maryland, Massachusetts, Missouri, North Carolina, Tennessee, Utah, Virginia, and Washington State. These resolutions will allow the VA, through authority that is delegated on a project-by-project basis by GSA, to enter into lease agreements for CBOCs. Several years ago, the VA began working with GSA to use its leasing authority to help the VA develop medical facilities. To ensure the VA continues utilizing this expertise, these resolutions contain a clause requiring the administrator of the GSA to oversee and monitor the delegation of authority to ensure that procurement is carried out consistent with the law and authority provided. Appreciate the level of detail regarding each of these projects that GSA has provided the committee to support these resolutions, and urge my colleagues to do the same. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. I support today's package of GSA resolutions, which include 15 leases for community-based outpatient clinics across the country. These leases will provide access to critical health care services for our veterans who shouldn't have to drive hours upon hours to receive the services that they indeed have earned. All of these health care centers have already been authorized by Congress. However, because the VA uses GSA's leasing authority, these prospectuses must be approved by the committee for these projects to proceed. It is important we make sure our veterans who bravely served our country have access to the health resources that they need. I urge my colleagues to support the GSA resolutions en bloc and yield the ballot.
Mr. Van Drew.
Chairman, I rise in strong support of the en bloc for the General Services Administration, which is aimed at improving access to healthcare services for veterans in communities, especially with insufficient facilities to meet the current needs of our veteran population. While these 15 resolutions do not specifically pertain to my district in South Jersey, their intent is of utmost importance to many deserving veterans in my district and across this nation. Construction is currently underway of a VA community-based clinic, outpatient clinic in Northfield, New Jersey, which is in my district, that will provide critical care to veterans across South Jersey. This new construction and other construction we've done on 3 other clinics in my district ensure that our South Jersey veterans are not forgotten and our nation's men and women who fight for our freedoms have accessible and affordable health care. It broke my heart to hear true stories of veterans in my district having to go through long and tough journeys to get to their nearest VA hospital. Until we start building these facilities, they easily would have been driving up to 3+ hours to get to a veterans hospital, which was, I think, unconscionable. It is no way to reward them for the good service they have given us in defending this nation. There should be clinics in much closer proximity to our vets, and these 15 new facilities would begin to alleviate this terrible circumstance that is affecting countless veterans across this great nation. I urge my colleagues to vote on both sides of the aisle, to support this on both sides of the aisle in this en bloc. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As chairman of the VA committee, I also want to give my word to the fact that our veterans, we need to make sure that the locations are correct and where they need to be. This en bloc does that. There's still a lot of work to be done, but this definitely moves us in the right direction. I stand in support of this amendment.
Anyone else wish to be heard? Seeing no one, are there any amendments to GSA resolutions in block? Hearing none, the question is now on the adoption of the GSA resolution in block. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The GSA resolutions in block are agreed to and approved. We are going to recess very briefly and return for votes. How many do we have? I think we have approximately 4 votes. So right now, the committee stands in recess for 5 minutes and subject to the call of the chair. Committee will come to order. The committee previously postponed proceedings on H.R. 1547. The question is now on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1547, which was previously postponed. First, Amendment 48, offered by Mr. Payne of New Jersey, to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1547, in which a recorded vote was ordered, which was not agreed to by voice vote. Is a recorded vote still requested? Mr. Payne, is a recorded vote still requested? A recorded vote is still requested. Clerk, please call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
No.
Chairman Graves votes no. Ranking Member Larson.
Yes.
Ranking Member Larson votes aye. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes no. Ms. Norton.
Aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes no. Mrs. Napolitano.
Yes.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Carson. Mr. Rouser. Mr. Rouser votes no. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Bost. Mr. Bost votes no. Mr. Huffman. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes no. Ms. Brownlee. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes no. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes no. Mr. Payne.
Aye.
Mr. Payne votes aye. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Mr. Desagne.
Aye.
Mr. Desagne votes aye. Mr. Stauber.
No.
Mr. Stauber votes no. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Burchett votes no. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton votes aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes no. Ms. Davids of Kansas. Ms. Davids of Kansas votes aye. Mr. Nels. Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Pappas. Mr. Pappas votes aye. Mr. Mann. Mr. Mann votes no. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes aye. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Yocum.
No.
Mr. Yocum votes no. Ms. Strickland. Ms. Strickland votes aye. Mrs. Chavez-DeReamer.
No.
Mrs. Chavez-DeReamer votes no. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Edwards.
No.
Mr. Edwards votes no. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan votes aye. Mr. Kane of New Jersey.
No.
Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes no. Mrs. Peltola. Mrs. Peltola votes aye. Mr. De-Esposito. Mr. De-Esposito votes no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez votes aye. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes no. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon.
Aye.
Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes aye. Mr. James. Mr. James votes no. Mrs. Sykes.
Aye.
Ms. Sykes votes aye. Mr. Van Orden. Mr. Van Orden votes no. Ms. Skolton.
Aye.
Ms. Skolton votes aye. Mr. Williams of New York. Mrs. Fushi. Mrs. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Molinaro. Mr. Molinaro votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Ezell. Mr. Ezell votes no. Mr. Duarte. Mr. Duarte votes no. Mr. Bean of Florida. Mr. Bean of Florida votes no.
Clerk, please call the absentees.
Mr. Cohen. Mr. Carson.
Mr. Carson is aye.
Mr. Carson votes aye. Mr. Huffman. Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Ms. Wilson of Florida votes aye. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Williams of New York.
Have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded? Please announce the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 27 ayes and 32 noes.
By a vote of 27 ayes, 32 noes, the amendment is not agreed to. The question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1547 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended is agreed to. The question is now on the adoption of and favorably reporting of H.R. 1547 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill as amended is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk, please call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
Aye.
Chairman Graves votes aye. Ranking Member Larson. Ranking Member Larson votes aye. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes aye. Ms. Norton.
Aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
Aye.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes aye. Mr. Rouser. Mr. Rouser votes aye. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Bost. Mr. Bost votes aye. Mr. Huffman. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Ms. Wilson of Florida votes aye. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Payne.
Aye.
Mr. Payne votes aye. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon.
Yes.
Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes aye. Mr. Desagne.
Aye.
Mr. Desagne votes aye. Mr. Stauber.
Aye.
Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Burchett votes aye. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton votes aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Ms. Davids of Kansas. Ms. Davids of Kansas votes aye. Mr. Nels. Mr. Nels votes aye. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Pappas. Mr. Pappas votes aye. Mr. Mann. Mr. Mann votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes aye. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Yakum.
Aye.
Mr. Yakum votes aye. Ms. Strickland. Ms. Strickland votes aye. Ms. Chavez-DeRemer.
Aye.
Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer votes aye. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Edwards.
Aye.
Mr. Edwards votes aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan votes aye. Mr. Kane of New Jersey.
Aye.
Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes aye. Mrs. Peltola. Mrs. Peltola votes aye. Mr. De-Esposito. Mr. De-Esposito votes aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez votes aye. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes no. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes aye. Mr. James. Mr. James votes no. Mrs. Sykes. Ms. Sykes votes aye. Mr. Van Orden. Mr. Van Orden votes aye. Ms. Skolton. Ms. Skolton votes aye. Mr. Williams of New York. Mrs. Fushi. Mrs. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Molinaro. Mr. Molinaro votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Ezell. Mr. Ezell votes aye. Mr. Duarte. Mr. Duarte votes aye. Mr. Bean of Florida. Mr. Bean of Florida votes aye.
Please call the absentees.
Mr. Cohen. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Williams of New York.
Have all members voted who wish to be recorded?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to change my vote to aye.
I'm sorry.
I'd like to change my vote to aye.
Yes, sir. Mr. James votes aye.
Have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded? Seeing none, please announce.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 56 ayes and 3 nays.
By a vote of 56 ayes and 3 nays, the bill as amended is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The committee previously postponed proceedings on H.R. 1752 as amended. The question is now on the adoption of and favorably reporting of H.R. 1752 as amended to the House of Representatives. A roll call vote is requested. The clerk, please call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
Aye.
Chairman Graves votes aye. Ranking Member Larson. Ranking Member Larson votes aye. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes aye. Ms. Norton.
Aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
Aye.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes aye. Mr. Rouser. Mr. Rouser votes aye. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Bost. Mr. Bost votes aye. Mr. Huffman. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Ms. Wilson of Florida votes aye. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne votes aye. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes aye. Mr. Desagne.
Aye.
Mr. Desagne votes aye. Mr. Stauber.
Aye.
Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Burchett votes aye. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton votes aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Ms. Davids of Kansas. Ms. Davids of Kansas votes aye. Mr. Nels. Mr. Nels votes aye. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Pappas. Mr. Pappas votes aye. Mr. Mann. Mr. Mann votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes aye. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Yakum.
Aye.
Mr. Yakum votes aye. Ms. Strickland. Ms. Strickland votes aye. Ms. Chavez-DeRemer.
Aye.
Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer votes aye. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards votes aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan votes aye. Mr. Kane of New Jersey.
Aye.
Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes aye. Mrs. Peltola. Mrs. Peltola votes aye. Mr. D'Esposito. Mr. D'Esposito votes aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez votes aye. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes aye. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes aye. Mr. James. Mr. James votes aye. Ms. Sykes. Ms. Sykes votes aye. Mr. Van Orden. Mr. Van Orden votes aye. Ms. Skolton. Ms. Skolton votes aye. Mr. Williams of New York. Mrs. Fushi. Mrs. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Molinaro. Mr. Molinaro votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Ezell. Mr. Ezell votes aye. Mr. Duarte. Mr. Duarte votes aye. And Mr. Bean of Florida. Mr. Bean of Florida votes aye.
Please call the absentees.
Mr. Cohen. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Williams of New York.
Have somebody holler in. Get D'Esposito. Have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded? Seeing none, please announce the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 58 ayes and 2 noes.
By a vote of 58 ayes and 2 noes, the bill as amended is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Thank you all for participating in today's markup. I'd ask unanimous consent that each measure ordered reported today be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute and incorporate any amendments adopted. Without objection, that is so ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make all necessary technical, clarifying, and conforming changes to each of the measures ordered reported today to reflect the actions of the committee. Without objection, that is ordered. Pursuant to Rule 22, Clause 1, I'd ask unanimous consent that the chairman or his designee be authorized to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the legislation adopted today or any similar measure. Without objection, that is so ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that the chairman, after consultation with the ranking member, have authority to strike or revise any provision of the measure ordered reported today that would cause a sequential referral to any other committee, or that would cause the bill to be subject to a Budget Act or Rule 21 Cutco point of order. Without objection, that is so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I'd ask unanimous consent that all members of the committee have at least 2 calendar days in which to file any supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views on the legislation adopted today. Without objection, that is so ordered. Pursuant to Rule 6 of the Rules Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, I note the presence of a quorum for all actions taken on all committee business today. And with that, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure has completed its business, and the committee is now adjourned.